Okay, good evening, everyone. This is our fourth and final installment of our Jewish history lecture series, exploring religious Zionism, halacha, hashkafa, and history. Tonight, we are going to learn about the life and times of Rav Avraham Yitzchak Kook. Now, before I talk about Rav Kook, I wanted to make a few additions to last week's shir, and that is I found a more explicit source for Rav Reinus. We spoke about Rav Yitzchak Reinus last time, the founder of the Mizrahi, and it's a more explicit source in which he stakes out a non-messianic vision of religious Zionism. So I wanted to read it with you, and then I wanted to do a few other sources, and then we'll go into Rav Kook. So this is from an article he wrote in Hamelitz. It's from 1900, translated later. Source number one. Anyone who thinks the Zionist idea is somehow associated with future redemption and the coming of the Messiah, and who therefore regards it as undermining our holy faith, is clearly in error. In other words, people would say, oh, Zionism, that's about bringing the redemption, like we saw in Rav Tzvi Kalisher. Or maybe we've reached the redemption. Then that would be maybe challenging our faith, because we have certain criteria. There has to be a melech, as the Rambam says. There have to be certain religious renewal and religious upswell. So some would say that redemption has not happened. So anyone who claims to believe in the Zionist project as redemptive is in error, he says, and that sort of saves him from the traditionalist claim against him, because he's saying, I don't believe in this as being the redemption. I believe in this as important. But it's a religion. He's a religious person adapting sort of his belief to defend Zionism, and he writes this explicitly. Zionism has nothing whatsoever to do with the question of redemption. The entire point of this idea is merely the improvement of the condition of our wretched brethren. This is why Rav Yitzchak Yaakov Reinus, even though it was shocking to some, supported the Uganda proposal, because he was not of the thinking that this is, the redemption and it's already happened and it's Chal Geula. He was saying this is a practical solution. We can't live here anymore in Europe, and we can't go to the land of Israel because it's not working out for us. Originally, he thought that would be the refuge, that would be the solution. Okay, so let's go to Uganda temporarily. He says, in recent years, our situation has deteriorated disastrously, and many of our brethren are scattered in every direction to the seven seas and the places where the fear of assimilation is hardly remote. So they're going to maybe America, but with the Treif and Medina, what's going to be with the people in America? So what's his solution? His solution is either Israel, or if not, Uganda. And he says, the Zionists saw that the only fitting place for our brethren to settle would be in the Holy Land. So he's saying, I'm fine with going with, working with these people, and he's a practical, pragmatic person, but Rav Yitzchak Yaakov Reinus is certainly not a messianic Zionist. So that I just wanted to show you an accurate quote. I think last time I didn't have a good quotation. This is a good citation. Another thing I wanted to do before we get into Rav Kook is read you a few excerpts of a debate that happened much closer to our current time that we're in history. It really happened in the religious Zionist community, and it was after the Yom Kippur War. After the Yom Kippur War, Rabbi Norman Lamb writes an article in Shema, and he writes that the community has to do al-chet, has to recite, their penance that they made a mistake on what he calls premature messianism. And premature messianism, Rabbi Lamb, he says that we were mistaken. We were too confident, either from a religious perspective, that we were too confident in the messianic, what he calls premature messianism, or on the secular vantage point, we were too confident in our state, in our army, and we couldn't imagine that that Yom Kippur War would happen. If you look at, there's a later article that was recently written in the Rabbi Lamb Memorial Edition of Tradition in 2021 by Rabbi Dr. Ari Berman, who is currently the president of Yeshiva University, and he quotes the discussion within the religious Zionist camp, and he quotes from the article itself. He says, first of all, he says, I must make clear, this is source number 2, this is a citation from Rabbi Lamb, I must make clear that I do not deny that ours is an error of incipient messianic redemption. He's not saying I know. What I'm saying is that I do not know whether it is or not, and that I challenge the certainty of those who assert such superior knowledge. So as you can imagine, this did not go without a response. And he may not be so well known to everybody here, but he was definitely someone who wrote a number of articulate articles, and he was a thinker in the religious Zionist community. His name was Rabbi Sherbert Spiro. And Rabbi Sherbert Spiro responds to Rabbi Lamb, and this is all cited in the Berman article, and he says, I thought it was cute, but I'll just tell you the last part of what Rabbi Lamb says, and you can look at it later. He says, it's sort of this naivete, and for sort of political decision making, he said, is also mistaken. We if we think that redemption is happening, we make mistakes in the political arena. And he says, this is not messianism, this is messyism. So that's a little cute. I know Paul would appreciate that.
Right up my alley.
So moving on to the response. So Rabbi Sherbert Spiro, he takes Rabbi Lamb to task, and he says as follows: would Rabbi Lamb deprive us of the exhilarating religious experience of recognizing beginnings, sensing opportunities, responding to partial redemptions? Can we, if we wanted to, blind ourselves to the incredible resemblance of our events to those promised long ago by the prophets and the sages of Israel? In other words, Rabbi Lamb is saying, we don't know. He's saying something pretty standard, from a religious perspective. You're not a prophet, you don't know. But then Rabbi Spiro is saying, well, does that mean everything that we see it's happening around us, we just say, I don't know, it robs us of that exhilaration of seeing history unfolding. And he says, we should look at the mitzvah of aliyah, and it's all sort of the same discussions happening even today. We should look at the mitzvah of aliyah charged with historic urgency, right? I was the Rabbinic Council of America, RCA conference, Rabbinic conference, earlier this year, and there was a rabbi who, he said, everyone has to make aliyah right now. This is the call. This is it. This is the time. It's urgent. And if you believe that the redemption is around the corner, so then that is it's not just a mitzvah, kiyumis, mitzvah chiyuvis. Is it a fulfillment of a mitzvah? Is it not? It's an urgent, historic decision. And Rabbi Berman quotes this debate between Rabbi Spiro and Rabbi Lamb. Welcome. In this journal, and he tries to argue for a third path where sort of he sees both voices, sort of converging. But what I wanted to just show you is that this debate about whether religious Zionism has to be dependent on or predicated on a vision of looking at history and being able to, identify whether we can understand it or whether we can't, is really at the heart of some of the early discussions of Zionism, which we talked about before, really all the way back to Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher and the opponents of Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher, Rav Shamshon Rafal Hirsch, saying what you think is a great mitzvah is not a small sin, because we're not called upon to force God's hand, so to speak, to bring the redemption. History has its path. We do what we have to do, and we don't necessarily, I'm reading into Rav Hirsch's response in the letter, but we spoke about how he said, it's not our job to interpret history. And this is the same debate happening even, it's not literally today, but in the 70s between Rabbi Lamb and Rabbi Spiro, and you saw Rav Yitzchak Yaakov Reines, the founder of the Mizrahi, taking the non-messianic perspective, which is completely, I would say, eclipsed at this point in today's current religious Zionist world. But I think it's important to see how this discussion unfolded. So that was sort of my addition from last week. And I'll close my edition with an introduction to Rav Kook, where Rav Kook, as you can imagine, he writes to his student Moshe Seidel in 1918 that Ischalta de Geula Vadai Holachas Umofia Lefaninu. It is certain we can see the unfolding of the beginning of the redemption right in front of us. So we would imagine that we're going to see that Rav Kook sort of becomes, even mostly after his passing, sort of becomes the face of the movement and becomes this messianic figure, whether he was or he wasn't. Maybe we'll get to some of the controversies tonight. So I saw some hands. Yes, Mark.
Rabbi Lamb referring to the Yom Kippur War being a fiasco after being on a high from the 6 Day War.
Yes, I think there's a bunch of reasons why he's writing specifically after the Yom Kippur War. Rav Yehuda Amital famously also was very, very affected by the Yom Kippur War. He lost many students after recently founding Yeshivat Har Tzion it was a moment that the Jewish people, October 7th, I think, was another inflection point. Yeah. But it was really an inflection point. But you see, this debate, I think, this is not more of a political discussion. I think it really cuts to the heart of religious Zionism and really the opposition that Rav Hirsch had to Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher. And it's really not so much about religious Zionism per se, it's about, can we interpret history? Can we see the unfolding of the kibbutz galuyos, the returning of the exiles to the land of Israel, and say, well, that would seem to fit with what the prophets are saying. Are we able to do that? And then should we make decisions? Like Rabbi Lamb is sort of, giving us a sharp criticism of the community that we made decisions and we made political decisions and we got too confident because of our, what he calls messianism or messianism, prematurely. And we have to be more calm and collected and to say, does this make sense for right now? Assuming that we're in a process, we don't know what the process is, and he says, I'm not denying that it is, but I don't know. Okay. Yes. Yeah. I don't know, but this is pretty right. This is pretty early. Yeah.
Nobody before that wrote about it.
Right.
This catchphrase of it all, right?
So this, I don't know. I didn't research where the earliest place that the term is used. This is pretty early, so to speak, in the 20th century. But
so what's the literal translation?
The beginnings of the redemption.
Okay.
Yeah. This is that would be an interesting shir unto itself. We could go through all the literature of Avinu Shabashamayim and where does that come from, and so famously, maybe not so famously, I know. So Rabbi Lamb did not say the prayer for the Shalom L'Medina that we have. He used the version they have in the UK, and that does not say Reishis Smichas Kulasenu. Rabbi Lamb did not say that in the Jewish Center in New York, even though Rabbi Lamb was, you can't get more religious Zionist, establishment. He was the president of Yeshiva University. He was the rabbi of the Jewish Center, which was in New York, like a very established, modern Orthodox intellectual bastion of that sort of that world. But Rabbi Lamb felt it was presumptuous for us to say whether we know or we don't. And Rabbi J.J. Schachter writes about his experience, and I think he's told us, I don't remember where I saw it first, I think it's written up somewhere. He becomes the rabbi in the Jewish Center. Rabbi Lamb is sitting right there. Rabbi Leo Young, who is another, prominent, extremely famous rabbi, is also in there. So I think it was, the young rabbi, he comes and he's not sure, he's handed a text for the prayers for the Shalom L'Medina, and he sees that it's not the one that he was used to saying and where he was from. And so Rabbi Lamb says, he explained to him his position, and he says, I don't think it was on the spot, maybe he told him beforehand, and he says, but you're the rabbi now, and it's your decision, I'll support you 100% what you decide. So we could give a whole shir. We should maybe after January, if there's still interest, which some people have said that they want to continue this lecture series, we could revisit after the breaks or whatever, revisit these questions. Maybe we could look at some Zionist liturgy and talk about the language and Reishis Smichas Kulasenu. We could all get really heated about, should we say, should we not say? I'll add one last thing, just anecdotally. I was in a shul in Passaic growing up, and this was a shul that, I don't know if it was a breakaway, but it was clearly not a standard shul because it was at someone's house. And I was there for, some Shabbos at my friend's house. I don't remember the whole story, but they got up to the Tefillah of Shalom Medina, and the Gabe was very excited, and someone warned me that they do something different, and I didn't know what he said, and he said, Shetehei Reishis Smichas Kulasenu. That it should be. He was like, that was like their addition. Like, we aren't going to say it is, but we pray that it should be. So there's all these different interesting, but it's the conversation's still happening. That's why I think it's so exciting about these stories, that really it sort of colors the entire dialogue. And Rav Kook so much is like almost the specter of Rav Kook hovers over almost everything about the conversations about religious Zionism. So let's start. We'll try. It's we have like 45 minutes to cover all of his life, all the controversies, all the mysticism. But we'll try. What I'll try to do is I'll just paint you a general picture. We'll go through some of the big flash points, which I know people like the controversies, but I think the controversies, while juicy and everything like that, they also give us sort of a sense of what was happening at the time, and you'll see how he responds to his critics, and you'll see how the critics respond to him. So I'll tell you where I get my information from. It's always important to know where is this guy come, right? So there's a fantastic biography on Rav Kook. It's written by Yehuda Mirsky. It's called Mystic in a Time of Evolution. And it's really, really incredible. And then also Rav Bitzal, I think he's a rabbi. Bitzal Neor has a lot of really wonderful work that he's done translating Orot. He has an introduction to it, which I utilize, and he also has a whole book called When God Becomes History that I also use. So those are the main sources, but there's others as well. So Rav Kook was no ordinary rabbi. He was no ordinary person. He was a genius of geniuses. He was really born into a somewhat Hasidic home. However, he studied in many of the great Lithuanian yeshivas. Primarily, we know him as studying in Volozhin, but he studied in other places as well. As we noted, many of the great Zionists had their roots originally in Volozhin, right? Rav Yitzchak of Rainis, the Netziv, we spoke about him. So Rav Kook is also from that yeshiva. So we'll go through a little bit the beginnings of Rav Kook in his younger years. So that's a picture. If you take a look, picture from the 1890s. I guess it's somewhat typical for those times, but he only lived 70 years. He passes away in 1935, born in 1865. 1865. 1880, he's age 15, source number 4. He leaves home, he's a budding Talmudist, but at the same time, he's studying in this yeshiva. He has a cousin who is a more Haskalically minded, or maybe even Hasidically minded. These things were not like we think of them as like he's a maskil, he's a chassid, he's a litvak. Like they were very, they were very fluid. Like things were moving and different things were happening. There was Musar was a whole controversy. Are you going to have new ideas? And we spoke about that many years ago with the Musar controversies. Hasidism was maskilim, reform. It was like the age of, as Mirsky's title, the time of revolution. And he starts going to his cousin's library, and in his free time outside of the yeshiva schedule, he was starting to write, beginning crafting his verses in parodying maskilic verse. So he's writing in Hebrew like a maskil. And when he comes home from yeshiva, he brings a whole notebook of poems. And his father gets a hold of it and does not hide his disappointment. And the next year, he brings home a notebook full of Talmudic glosses. But he was just reading everything. He was interested in everything, thinking about big picture questions, as we'll see soon. He comes into contact with Rabbi Elio David Rabinowitz Tu'umin, who is known by his acronym, the Aderet. The Aderet was very taken by Rav Kook. Aderet is really also another story in and of itself, somewhat of a tragic figure, immensely learned, seems to be a gentle soul, but never really reaps the rewards of any position. He eventually gets to the land of Israel to assume Rav Shmuel Salant's position as the chief rabbi of Yerushalayim, but Rav Shmuel Salant, actually, who was a very old man at that time, actually the Aderet predeceases Rav Shmuel Salant, so he never actually ends up getting that position, and he becomes embroiled in some of the debates and some of the controversies around his son-in-law. Spoiler alert: the Aderet marries the Rav Kook marries the Aderet's daughter, and he writes about his love for this amazing soul. The Aderet says about Rav Kook, "My soul cleaved to him. I loved him profoundly at my first glimpse of him and his extraordinary talents and piety. I saw he would become a great, mighty cedar." And eventually Rav Kook gets engaged and marries his daughter, Batsheva Rabinowitz Tu'umin, in 1886. He goes off to study in Volozhin, becomes a very close student of the Netziv, and his time in Volozhin was very interesting. He was, again, we mentioned before, he was very interested in different ideas. He was writing in Hebrew He was also influenced by the Hasidic and mystical teachings, and was involved with study of Kabbalah and different things. So he's here in this yeshiva. Now, Volozhin Yeshiva had so many different thinkers that were, sort of emerging from that yeshiva, even though it was a standard yeshiva in terms of the curriculum, but there was a lot of different things going on. There were covert maskilim, there were people who had Zionist, meetings, there were just a lot of different things going on. So here's a story, just to give you a sense of what was happening during the time that Rav Kook was in Volozhin in his early years. So here, Micha Yosef Berdichevsky, who later emerged as a Hebrew literary giant, was definitely broke from tradition, but he was the son of a Hasidic Rebbe, and he was in Volozhin at the time that Rav Kook was there. So, how did he get there? He arrived after being driven from the home of his father-in-law for reading Haskalah literature. I'm reading from, this is in the Mirsky book. So continuing here, he says, but the thing is, Berdichevsky, he was sitting in Talis Tefillin all day. So he's sitting in Talis Tefillin, and he sees that Rav Kook, his classmate, also was from a different world. And one of the things that the Netziv would tell people, another just giving you a general, painting a picture, is that anyone who had questions in Emunah, questions in faith, he would tell them, go speak to Rav Avraham Yitzchak Cohen Kook. He called him Mein Avram Itzi. I think that's how you pronounce it. Meaning my Avram Yitzchak, he was so affectionate, he felt very close to him. Now, another student, Zelig Reuven Bengis, he records the following story. He noticed one day that Rav Kook, during Talmud study, would repeatedly look down at some papers on a shelf of his study stand. On a stender, so you had your Gemaras, so you have to sneak the little the things underneath. So what's he looking at? So thinking that Rav Kook was stealing glances at maskilic literature and newspapers, Bengis reports to his fears to Berlin. He goes and tells the Netziv, the Rosh Hashiva, you're famous, you're mine Yitzchak Idzik, the one that you are so. He's not so what you think. He's not so ay. So Berlin tells him, stay away from, he's a tzaddik, leave him alone. The Netziv says, right? But, as we know, can't restrain yourself, can't hold yourself back. So when Rav Kook, I guess, went to the washroom or whatever it was, he looked underneath. What was Rav Kook, underneath the Gemara? What was there? In the mysterious papers, what did he find? Pieces of papers handwritten with the name of God on the papers. So Rav Kook is doing these interesting things, not in any way typical, and he was very difficult to pin down. Was he a maskil? Was he a tzaddik? Was he Litvish? Was he Hasidish? He wore a beard. No one in Volozhin wore a beard. He had a beard. And Rav Chaim Soloveitchik was the other Rosh Hashiva. Rav Chaim, the Brisker dynasty, he used to speak with Rav Kook in learning. He used to talk in learning before when he was preparing for the shir. But then he generally would tell people to beware of this tzaddik from Griva, and in those terms, the Misnagdic world, that's what Mirsky claims, that this was not a compliment. To be a tzaddik was not, the tzaddik, stay away from that tzaddik. So he had these different, even then, different reputations, different worlds that he was in, and sort of this very unique thinker that was not clear to the rest of the yeshiva exactly what he was up to doing. He eventually gets smicha from the Aruch HaShulchan, Rav Yechiel Michal Epstein, and then he marries in 1886, as we mentioned before. Now he moves in with Yaderet, and who himself, as we mentioned, was somewhat of never found his own, and he didn't have much money. And basically, because of financial constraints, Rav Kook has to take a rabbinic position. That was seemingly not the plan, but he has to take a rabbinic position, and he takes a number of different positions in Eastern Europe. Just to give you a sense of some of the types of things he was writing at the time or discussing with his peers, he wrote, I'm just giving you some excerpts here from the Mirsky book, just as there are laws in poetry, so is there poetry in laws. The idea of freedom of thought has become debased and castrated since it's used by slaves of one thought to war against slaves of another. So long as heretics are engaged with ethics and expanding the good, that is a quest for God. And Rav Kook gets involved in the writings of the Ramchal and the mystical teachings of Tikkun, of rectifying the world. He gets involved in interest in Agada, in philosophy, in maskilic writings. He's speaking in Hebrew like a maskil. He thinks about general questions. I'm just summarizing what we have from his notebooks. He was writing notebooks incessantly, and even today, we don't even have all of his notebooks published. They're just starting to come out with more of his notebooks, but he wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote, and many of the writings that we have that are put together in Sfarim were really edited by other people and put into works. He thought about general questions of reorganizing halacha, nationalism, Jewish identity, the movements of history. He had a passion about tefillin, which he saw as a unification of the body and the soul. He was thinking about these different people in his own circle who were becoming secular and breaking from tradition, noticing the Musar controversies that the world was embroiled in. And interestingly enough, at this point in his life, he was not really so interested in Zionism per se. We have some of his reaction to the first Zionist conference, which he did not attend. And what he was really interested in, I know we think of Rav Kook as like the big Zionist rabbi, but at the time, at that point, he was really not so interested in party politics. He was somewhat disturbed that the Mizrahi was willing to take sort of a back seat and become subordinate players to this bigger movement. He didn't think that was the correct approach. He thought we have to be like sort of the leaders of this movement. And we have some of his reaction to the Zionist movement, the Zionist conference. And the first, he thought maybe we can reorganize the Sanhedrin and then finally reorganize or rethink the way halacha works. That was sort of what he was thinking. He wasn't thinking so much along the terms or the lines of the Zionist movement. Okay. He's writing about the early stirrings of nationalism, but less about the practical return to the land and about like the politics of it, and more of just the general ideas. Okay, just for time's sake, trying to move a little bit ahead. As I mentioned to you, he was critical of Mizrahi. Mirsky makes this point. He thought later on he actually forms his own party called Degel Yerushalayim, which is a big failure. Part of the problem with Rav Kook is he didn't really see himself as a politician. However, he was thrust into certain moments of time, and he was sort of placed in these different difficult positions, which you'll see really required some political maneuvering. Okay, I'm skipping ahead a little bit. Okay, let's move ahead to when he's chosen to be the chief rabbi of Yafo. So Yafo, there was no Tel Aviv. Okay, this is the early 20th century. Tel Aviv is not founded yet, but there was a new movement of Zionists, of new ideas, of a new Jew. We talked about those ideas of the cultural Zionism versus political Zionism last week, but there was this new movement and sort of centered around this city called Yafo. And there was a vacancy now that the chief rabbi who was before him passed away, and there was a question of who would assume the mantle, who would sort of be the face of this new community. And Yoel Moshe Solomon, who was a descendant of early immigrants to Palestine, and we talked about that movement, he was actually the great-grandfather of my family's Rav in Passaic, Rabbi Ron Yitzchak Eisenman. He talks about him a lot. He's written about him. And so Yoel Moshe Solomon recruits or joins a committee to basically find a rabbi for Yafo. And Solomon somehow comes across Rav Kook. And he's taken by Rav Kook, and he sees this idea, this open thinker, this Talmudic scholar who has this really, this passion and striking receptivity to new ideas, conciliatory personality, someone who he sees as potentially the future rabbi of Yafo. And he goes to the Aderet, and they basically propose him to be the rabbi of Yafo. And after negotiating for actually a number of years and building some backers and looking into it and researching it, Rav Kook accepts. And by the way, I didn't mention this before, but Rav Kook's first wife passes away very shortly after they get married, about 3 years later, and then the Aderet actually asks him to marry his daughter who just passed, her cousin, and he marries the cousin, and still stays very close with the Aderet. We don't really know what his goal was. We could presume he wanted to be reunited with his former father-in-law, who he was very close with. We can understand that there was this new opportunity. At the same time, we have letters that a friend wrote to him, admonishing him about Yaffo and saying it's a metropolis of desolate sin. Be careful, about these people. And at this point, he was not at the table. He wasn't at the Zionist conference. He was sort of this big thinker, interesting, tzaddik, maskil, not sure exactly what he is. To show you how he was so not involved in really what was going on, we have testimony from Rav Yitzchak Nissenbaum. Rav Yitzchak Nissenbaum was a writer and an orator of the Chibat Zion movement, and he said, I had heard of this rabbi, but I wasn't very interested in him. I didn't think he was really a Zionist who was involved, and so before, I guess, he goes to Yaffo, Nissenbaum meets with Rav Kook, and we have sort of his impressions. He says, this was the phrase that I use, which is the title of the chapter in the beginning of Mirsky's book, No Ordinary Rabbi. It comes from Nissenbaum. So he says they discussed, for 3 days in Boisk, which is where they were before they left. He discusses different things, different life questions, and Agada, and he says, I saw before me no ordinary rabbi. This is source number 6. Following well-worn paths. I'm not seeing this rabbi, going on the conventional path, but a man of the spirit, paving his own way. He had not found it yet, but was searching for it in all of the length and breadth of Judaism. He was diving into the seas of a Talmud, Midrash, philosophy, Kabbalah, Hasidism, the new Hebrew literature, and bringing up precious stones with which to pave his way. And in 1904, April 24th, 1904, the Kook family left Boisk for Palestine. And here's where the first controversy, which we'll do together, hopefully we'll do a few of them, breaks out. Very shortly after Rav Kook immigrates to Palestine and becomes the chief rabbi of Yaffo, anyone know what happens? 1904, Herzl passes away. Now, if you're a new rabbi in a new community, the one thing that you want to do is you want to avoid controversy. The controversy will come, but, the first few months of your tenure, you don't, this is the problem. He comes to this community. He knows that Herzl is this big, larger-than-life figure. He's not really sure of what his path is. He knows he wants to make the people feel like he can be their rabbi, he can represent them. At the same time, Herzl was not a religious figure. He was not even, we talked about this before, he didn't have a bar mitzvah, he didn't give a child a bris milah. And so Herzl passes away, and the community comes to Rav Kook, and they say, you need to give a hesped. You need to give a eulogy. So, you know about this. So he's stuck between a rock and a hard place. What is he supposed to do? On the one hand, a typical rabbi, halachically, and also just the optics of it, you're giving a eulogy for someone who was not a religious person, who didn't really stand for the values so that's a question. So he, on the other hand, if he doesn't do it, he shows the people that he's not really supporting them. He's not really giving them what they thought they wanted in the rabbi. And he knows on the other hand, also he knows he's not a fool. He knows that there are traditionalists, and there's a long history and tradition of zealotry in Palestine, and specifically we'll see from the Yishuv Hayashan, the old Yishuv from Yerushalayim. And he knows that if he does this eulogy, there's going to be some backlash. So, before we see what he does, just to give you a sense of how controversial it was, and this is just another incredible find, Rabbi Philip Moskowitz from Boca Raton Synagogue, he helped me find this, and he talks about it in one of his shiurim. So Rav Yitzchak Nissenbaum, this is also from Nissenbaum, who was from the Chibat Zion movement. He writes in his Sefer, source number 7, Alei Chaldi, he says, I was asked to speak in Yerushalayim about Zionism. I was invited to come and give a talk about Zionism, but he was, politically astute, so he went and wrote to Rav Shmuel Salant, as I mentioned him before, the person who the Adar was hoping would pass away and he would assume his position, who he didn't. What? He was, he kind of was he was like the, yeah, whatever. It was sort of understood that he would come in to be the rabbi, but it never happened. Yeah, you're right. Maybe he wasn't hoping it, but he hoped that things would work out, and it didn't work out for him. So he writes to Rav Shmuel Salant, who was like he at that point was holding it all together. After he passes away, things really break down and the camps break apart. But Rav Shmuel Salant sort of was the arching sort of neutral position, keeping everyone sort of together. And he writes to Rav Shmuel Salant asking him, is this a good idea? Should I come to Yerushalayim to give this talk about Zionism? So Rav Shmuel Salant writes back to him, and he records this in his work. He says as follows. I asked Rav Shmuel Salant levakish mimenu rishus lidros bebeis hakeneshes hagadol asher bechurva. I was asked to give, I believe this is the same churva shul, and I was asked to give this drasha on Zionism. So what did Rav Shmuel Salant say back to him? He says, I am very afraid of you doing this. He writes, Yirapen yavo hakanoim. Perhaps the zealots will come. Hakanoim hayushalmim. The Jerusalemite zealots. V'yeshnu atam asayim. She'asu b'shana she'avra be'es ha'hesped al ha'Dr. Herzl. Which is what they did on the year in 1904 when Herzl was given his eulogy. Now this is not the eulogy that Rav Kook gave, because Rav Kook gave it in a bank in Yafo, and he just says in Yerushalayim. But he says what happened in he says it was the Beit HaKnesses Asher B'churva. They were maspid Herzl. It doesn't say who did it. There was a hesped in 1904 in the Churva Shul for Herzl. And what did they do? And this is Rav Shmuel Salant telling Rav Nissenbaum not to come. He says, what did they do? You can't make this up. Because what did they do? Nidchaku hakanoim bitzoch ha'amon. The zealots, hid themselves amongst the people. B'machatim, with needles. Ashir b'yedeim b'basar hashomim. Excuse me for a moment, but they took needles and they pushed them into the person sitting next to them's tush. Okay, so what you can imagine what they're doing. So they shashomim saku, the people listening, like, ah! And then he says, what happened? The Beis HaKnesses is mehuma gedolah. There was this great, uproar, and the hamaspid nifsak be'emsa, and they had to cancel the eulogy. So in 1904, in the Churva Shul, during the hesped for Herzl, the Kanoim, the zealots, came with needles, and they poked the people next to them who started screaming, and they weren't able to finish the hesped. I'm not giving anyone ideas. If they don't like what the rabbi's saying in the shul, don't come with your needles. But that's a very easy way to stop someone from speaking, because they think everyone's screaming, everyone hates this, and nobody really knows what's happening except for the people who are the stabbing with the needles. So we see that this is not just like, what he's going to say or he's not going to say. This is a real big question. And the jury's not out yet on Herzl. It's sort of like he was on the scene for 8 years, passes away. The movement is still in flux. We don't know the end of the story. Today we know the end of the story, or sort of the end of that era, but they didn't know what was happening. They didn't know they'd get a state. They didn't know. So this is like tensions are really high. So Rav Kook makes, everyone, he does something which, we'll see a theme in his career. He does something which makes everyone upset at him. He does something brilliant, but it ends up getting, different sides of the debate upset with him. So he gives a hesped for Herzl, probably one of the most lauded, famous speeches he ever gives in his life. And it's really brilliant. I don't think we'll have time to do it tonight. I'll tell you generally what he says. He gives a hesped, so he says yes, which obviously upsets many people from the traditionalist camp. However, he never mentions Herzl's name. Now, if you're a rabbi giving a hesped, the one thing that you should do, right, to give some people the comfort is to mention the person's name.
Covered, yeah.
If you look at the text of the hesped, it has a title, HaHesped B'Yerushalayim. It's known colloquially as HaHesped B'Yerushalayim. It actually was not in Yerushalayim. We'll see. It's actually a citation from a pasuk. But if you look at the text, you would never know it was about Herzl. If you look at the text. What does he say? So I have this on the source sheet. Maybe if you're interested, you can look at it yourself. I'll just generally tell you, it's HaHesped B'Yerushalayim is a paraphrase or is really a lifting from the Psukim in Zechariah. And in Zechariah, it says there's going to be this great hesped. This great eulogy is going to happen, greater than or just as great as when Hadad Rimon was killed in the plains of Megiddo, Megiddon, and also just as great as when here you look at the source number 9. It says this great hesped on that day, Saftu alav k'misped al yachid v'himar alav k'himar al b'chor. It'll be just this hesped will be so great, just like the hesped given on someone who was a firstborn who had passed away, and just as great as Bayomahu Yigdal Masped Yerushalayim K'misped Hadar Rimon Bibikas Megidon. It doesn't say the two individuals. Sorry, that's the Targum Yonasan. So if you're wondering who this person is, the Hadar Rimon Bivikas Megidon, so don't worry. The Gemara also asks, who is this? And the Gemara says that Targum Yonasan Ben Uziel tells us it was two individuals. I'm just going to go a little bit quicker just for time's sake. It's not so important who those two individuals were for our purposes, but the Gemara says that who was this anonymous individual whose hesped would be so great, it would be like those two individuals. It was, according to some, the Gemara in Sukkah says on Daf Nun Gimel, was Mashiach ben Yosef. We're back to Mashiach ben Yosef. We started our lecture series with the messianism or questionable messianism of the Vilna Gaon, and this is where Kook draws his ideas from, I believe. He doesn't say it explicitly, but he draws his ideas from the Vilna Gaon, the Kol HaTorah that we mentioned, which was attributed to the Vilna Gaon and questioned by others. And he says that really that we generally know of Mashiach ben David. We know of him as the Messiah who's going to be a descendant of the Davidic dynasty. What many of us don't know is this other figure, Mashiach ben Yosef, who apparently is going to die, and there's going to be a great hesped for him. Now, why is this important? Because Rav Kook dances around this idea, but he basically alludes to the fact that there will be two movements in the Jewish people. He draws on Psukim in Tanakh about the Malchus Yisrael, Malchus Yehuda. Yisrael had more of a political power, more materialism. Yehuda had the Beis HaMikdash, they were more spiritual. And he says that the two have to work together in order for the redemption to come. And he says that the problem with Malchus Yisrael is they didn't want to work together. They didn't want Yehuda to be in charge. It's not totally divorced from ideas of coming up in a few weeks parshios of Kol Yaakov Hadai Midei Esav. Some say that Yaakov had to be the one, the spiritual, and then Esav was the one in the field, and it was a unity of purpose. And Rav Kook says that the body and the soul have to come together, and he doesn't say this explicitly, but he keeps talking about this Mashiach ben Yosef figure who dies, and he's talking about Herzl. So people are like, okay, you're saying that Herzl was Mashiach ben Yosef. And word gets back to, you can imagine, the father-in-law, the Aderet, and people are telling him, you know what your son-in-law is doing? Previous, because his wife, you know what he's doing? He's saying that Herzl was the Messiah. So there's a letter, we won't go read it all together. You could see the letter on the source sheet. His father-in-law, obviously asks him what's happening, what's going on, and Rav Kook says, I had said things, I was trying to balance this. He goes through his what we talked about. It's between a rock and a hard place. I'm trying to show the people that I support them. At the same time, I didn't say what people are saying that I said. And, there are things that people are erroneously attributing to me, which I never meant to say. Fine. Okay. Yes.
My understanding is that Mashiach ben Yosef can be, there's a Mashiach ben Yosef in every generation. And it doesn't have to be a person. It can be a movement.
Right.
So
it could be.
It could be.
He doesn't say that. He doesn't say, yes, I did say it. He doesn't say to his father-in-law, yes, I accept. I did believe. He says, no, I did not say that. He was talking about the idea of Mashiach ben Yosef, but yeah, I don't know. It's a very... Excuse me. It's possible. Okay, there's a whole... Yeah, I think we're going to have to skip the Ben Yehuda controversy just to whet your appetite. There's a whole issue with Eliezer ben Yehuda. I just don't think we'll have time. If we have time, we'll go back to it. Okay, I'm skipping way ahead. In 1919, after Rav Kook actually leaves, he got stuck in Europe during World War I, Rav Kook is summoned back in 1919 to become the chief rabbi of Yerushalayim. Now, this is very, very important because, as I alluded to before, we have this Yishuv Hayashan, the old Yishuv in Yerushalayim, who have no interest in Rav Kook being their rabbi, quote unquote, but there is reason that the British want, they had this idea of a chief rabbinate. There's a lot of reasons behind it. Without getting into all the details, they sought out Rav Kook, and they felt he would be the right candidate. And he accepts, actually at the encouragement of Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, who had sort of this, again, he had respect in the Yishuv Hayashan, but he also was very close with Rav Kook. And he comes back in 1919. Now, what does he do when he comes back? So there's this whole passage here. I'll read it from the Mirsky book. It's a very, very moving passage, and it's also very important to understand the dynamics here. So the Cooks come from Liverpool, and they leave, and they eventually arrive at Jaffa, and there's a whole delegation here from Yerushalayim to offer him this letter of appointment. And now, you understand, he needs to get these reshus, he needs to get his permission from Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld. Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld and Rav Yehuda Leib Diskin were like the leaders of the Yishuv Hayashan. And so what he does is, very soon after he arrives, he needs to get their permission for becoming the chief rabbinate, becoming the chief rabbi. So first he goes to a whole crowd of people and he visits the Kosel. And then right afterwards with his student, I think we mentioned him perhaps, or maybe we didn't, but Rav Yaakov Moshe Charlap, he goes with Rav Yaakov Moshe Charlap, who was also this, old Yishuv personality, but also part of this new movement. So he goes with the student, and who does he go to? He goes to Rav Sonnenfeld. So this is, again, you could just see the tensions here. So Rav Sonnenfeld meets with Rav Kook, and Rav Kook is sort of asking him, but almost like saying, I have this letter, and this is what's happening, but it's appropriate for me to come and ask for permission. And so he, Rav Sonnenfeld, sort of trying to be polite, he says as follows. This is in source number 16. I wish for you to become the high priest once the Messiah rebuilds our temple. It's you could be the Kohen Gadol. Be the Kohen Gadol when the Beis HaMikdash comes. Implying almost like, he's being nice. He's saying you're a holy tzaddik. Back to the talk before, but I don't want you to be the chief rabbi. Rav Kook said, "I'd be happy to be a Kohen Hedyot. I'd be happy to be a run-of-the-mill priest." Now, this is the conversation we have, and obviously we know the story. He becomes chief rabbi, and Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld is the leader of the opposition. I do have in the beginning of our on the front page of our lecture series. In the front page of the source sheet, you can see Rav Kook is sitting surrounded by all these people, and he's sitting right next to Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld. So they really did have a lot of respect for each other. You can, but you'll see there's obviously differences of opinion, but they did have a lot of mutual respect for each other. Now, another thing just to mention is that Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld always refers to Rav Kook as the Yuferuv. He's on the Hungarian accent. The Yuferuv. The Rav of Yaffo, the Yuferuv. Almost, again, he's saying, like we would say today, he's the rabbi from Tel Aviv. Now, even the ones he assumes the chief rabbinate, he's still the rabbi from Tel Aviv. So it's sort of like giving him respect, but not according him the actual position that he has. It's sort of like his double entendre that he was good for Yaffo. This is Yerushalayim. It's sort of, again, the stakes in some of the other disputes that we didn't do, but you see some of the fault lines are formed, and things really get difficult when Rav Kook suffers his own personal tragedy. One of his daughters, who was very young at the time, I believe 12 years old, falls down the stairs and dies very soon after his coming to Yerushalayim. And then in 1920, there's a massive controversy surrounding the publication of his work, Obrot. And this is when we were talking about his writings in his notebooks, and he was writing, and many of the things he wrote years ago, but it was not yet published, and it did not come to the public eye. And now that he's a chief rabbi, and now that he's being published, this massive controversy erupts. And it's over a couple of passages where Rav Kook says, for time's sake, I don't think we're going to have a chance to read all of it, but Rav Kook says that, back to the idea we said before of the unifying the body and the soul, which was a fascination of his, even when he was writing about the tefillin back in the 1890s, and he writes that we need a connection between the people of Israel who are the youth who are exercising and perfecting their body in the Tel Aviv doing exercise, and the Haredim. There probably wasn't the term Haredim, but the regular, he calls them, he calls them the. What does he call them? The regular Jews, the regular religious community. And he says that the people who are exercising and trying to perfect their people are doing avodas hakodesh, and maybe even more important than those who are studying Torah, the tzaddikim who are studying Torah. And people go crazy, and they say, the people who are exercising in Tel Aviv are just as or more important? They're doing avodas hakodesh? And he says things in Orot, you can see on your source sheet, source number 1718. He says things to the Poshe Yisrael. He says, Poshe Yisrael should be ikvasa de Mashiach. The sinners of the Jewish people at the ends of the footsteps of the Messiah, they have this idea of nationalism and this idea of building up the country. And he says they have a clearer understanding than the frum people in the religious community who are just learning Torah and studying and learning Torah and doing mitzvahs. They have this clear understanding, even though they don't have the spirit, the ruach of Torah, but they understand that they have to work for the greater good of the klal, of the people. And he writes this, and he talks about they need to be working together. But the fact that he even says that about these people, these sinners, they go crazy on him. And then you can see there's a picture of I found this online. I believe it's accurate. I found it on one of these auction sites that they have, and this is an original. It's not original on your source sheet, but it's a picture of the auction site that has what's called the Kol HaShofar. The Kol HaShofar was this band that was written in response to Orot, and they write, it's forbidden to read this, and you need to distance yourself from this person, and it's signed by a number of the people we discussed before, Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld and Rav Yoshua Leib Diskin, and others of the old Yishuv. I'm not going to be able to read it for you now, just trying to get through all of this. Okay, what happens? We have this massive embroilment. Now just think about it. Rav Kook was literally from their world. He's went to Volozhin. He's this huge Talmud Chacham. Right. Why are they picking on him? Because what are they going to do? They're going to write about Achad Ha'am and they're going to write about Weizmann. Rav Kook is the closest target that they have, and it's almost like they feel almost like a betrayal.
Biggest threat.
And he's a threat because we understand at this point the Yeshiva Yashan never produced the greatest yeshivos. They also they weren't self-sufficient. They were always relying on others to raise money for them. And really the Zionists at this point are starting to control what's happening. So we understand that the center of power is moving away. And there's this massive debate over this book. And Rav Kook is trying to keep the peace. At the same time, he's this big thinker writing these ideas. So who tries to step in to make peace? The Imrei Emes, Rav Avraham Mordechai Alter, the Ger Rebbe. The Ger Rebbe comes to Eretz Yisrael to try to broker peace between Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld and Rav Kook. Just to put it into perspective, I heard this from Rav Shechter, I believe, or maybe I heard it in his name. But just to put it in perspective, Rav Shechter said Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld was a wonderful Talmud Chacham, but he said he didn't hold a candle to Rav Kook. I'm not someone to weigh, Talmid Chachamim. But Rav Kook was he was an incredible, just shoulders above many, many different people. I believe Rav Shechter said this, but either way, he was coming from the old Yishuv, and this was not their derech. And the Imrei Emes tries to step in and make peace. He speaks to Rav Kook. Rav Kook says, he writes him an apology. Rav Kook says, I'm going to, don't worry, I'm not going to break these communal boundaries. And the Ger Rebbe writes a letter which becomes almost like canonical within certain sects, where he writes his letter. I don't know exactly how it became public, but he wrote it to his family, and he writes a letter on his way back from his trip about Rav Kook and his impressions. And he writes as follows. Source number 20. He talks about Hagon Rav Yitzchak, Avraham Yitzchak Kook Sheyichya, who ish eshkolos. He is a person he knows everything. He's a Renaissance person. Torah, in Torah, Midos. Yes, the Gemara refers to Rabbi Yehuda as that. Gam Rabim Omrim Kihu Sone Betza. Many people say that he hates money. Ulam, however, Ahavastu Letzion, his love for Zion, Overes Kol Gevul. It sort of breaks all of his boundaries. Yeah. Va'omra tamei tar. This is a reference to Rabbi Meir, who said and made things that were tamei tar, that were impure, pure. Umar lo pnim, and he sort of and he's following halacha. He's ruling halacha that is not proper. I have a translation here that I'm not reading. I'm not sure why, but it's from Betzal Naor. One second here. This is the translation. His love for Zion surpasses all limits, and he declares the impure pure and adduces proof to it. And he references Rabbi Meir, who we say in the Gemara in Eruvin, there was no equal to him, right? There was no one like him. However, right? No ein bedoro kamoso, but lo nikba halacha kamoso. So this is sort of his perspective. He was a tremendous personality, tremendous tzaddik, but he was blurring the lines, going too far, and he was going too far. His love just brought him too far. Okay, the final controversy, which we only have a few minutes left, that I wanted to do with you, is the famous speech at the inauguration of Hebrew University. And you have a picture here, which is really interesting to me. Who here has to go to the 9 o'clock Marv? A few people. Okay. So, whatever. It's being recorded, so maybe we'll go a few minutes over.
Yeah.
But
I'll listen.
so this is a picture of Rav Kook speaking at the Hebrew University inauguration in 1925. Now, the fact is that, first of all, the foundation stone was laid in 1918, but it was only inaugurated in 1925. And we know that it was in this large theater. I'm getting a lot of this information from an article that was written by Ari Zivotofsky, who utilizes the work of Dr. Shneur Lyman and others. But the facts are that there was an incredibly prestigious audience that was there. Yeah, it could be Einstein was there. First of all, Winston Churchill was there. At the time, he wasn't yet prime minister. We have Chaim Weizmann, who is the future president of Israel. The chief rabbi of Britain, Yosef Herman Hertz. We have Herbert Louis Samuel. We have Sir Lord Edmund Henry Hyman Allenby, Professor William Foxwell, Albright, many dignitaries. Lord Balfour himself. And Rav Kook is asked to give this speech. Now again, the fact that he's speaking at Hebrew University, which you understand what Hebrew University, it was the intellectual, we'll call it sort of an intellectual justification of the Zionist project. And it was going to be a new, like again, talked about our previous discussions about cultural Zionism. It wasn't going to be a religious institution, right? It would be maybe in some ways teaching Hebrew, and it was not exactly clear what it was going to be, but it was definitely a bastion of this new Zionist school of an interest in sort of rethinking things and seen by most of the traditional camp as moving away from our traditional Judaism. So the fact that he speaks at it all is a big statement. He's giving support to this new project. So he decides to accept, as we see in the picture he's speaking. Now, just to give a little bit of perspective, it was a blistering hot day. You see Rav Kook's wearing his shtreimel there. It was a blistering hot day, and Rav Kook gives a very long speech, 45 minutes. Gosh. Okay? There's reports that throughout the speech, Chaim Weizmann is passing notes up to the front saying, when are you going to stop? Are you finished yet? And Rav Kook keeps saying, no, I keep having... And Rav Kook he gives this big speech, which we'll talk about in a moment. Now, there's a big misconception about this speech, and you may have even heard it before. The misconception is documented by Rabbi Zivotofsky, but you probably heard this before, that Rav Kook invokes Ki mitzion tete Torah in his speech, referencing, the Dvar Hashem Yosem Yerushalayim, that the Dvar Hashem Yerushalayim is coming from Hebrew University. This is the pinnacle of what we hoped for in Zion. And obviously that offends many who would say, even if you're going to say this is a step, even if you're going to say that we want to work together and we have a unifying of the body and the soul, and the people who are Poshe Yisrael, the sinners, they don't really understand, and they're working towards a national movement who, as we mentioned, Rav Kook is trying to unify and bring together and try to harmonize, even if you'll say that, but to say this is the Kimitzion Teitzei Torah, that is totally ridiculous and is seen as many use this as a criticism of Rav Kook. That's the misconception. The fact of the matter is that Rav Kook actually in his speech does not refer to a Hebrew university as Kimitzion Teitzei Torah, but rather he gives a great cautionary warning that we need to be careful about this new institution. We need to make sure that it's dedicated to Torah. And he actually talks about his ambivalence at its founding, which again, as I mentioned, makes everybody upset. You're speaking at the Hebrew University inauguration, so you're giving credibility. So there's traditionalists, the old Yeshuv didn't like that. But then he basically talks down to the people there and say, I'm really nervous about this. I'm really not so sure. The biblical criticism was a big concern of his. And he sort of almost like, isn't, I would say, ambivalent at best, and maybe at worst, critical of what could happen with this institution. So that was what Zivotofsky writes, that he says, even though, despite the fact that Rav Kook's true intention in citing the verse is quite clear, this misconception is still perpetuated, sometimes maliciously and sometimes naively. Unfortunately, most people are not familiar with the actual content of Rav Kook's brilliant invocation. Even more courageous was his message. In front of a theater full of enthusiastic supporters of this new endeavor, he minced no words in expressing his true feelings regarding the Hebrew University and its place in the life of a revitalized Jewish yeshuv in the land of Israel. So he basically is very concerned and very we're not going to be any different than what he writes most people. We're not going to do the actual text of it, but he writes about his concern for what could negatively happen with this new founding. So I have one last thing to share with you, but what I want to we've seen a number of different controversies. Rav Kook was somewhat of a tragic figure. He was well beyond his time, trying to hold everything together, envisioning sort of a unity of the religious and the secular working together to create a state. He doesn't even live to see the state. However, at the same time that he was somewhat of a tragic figure and personally had a number of tragedies, he clearly gave intellectual and spiritual not even justification, but the whole world of Rav Kook gives a whole. It energizes and gives vitality and to the entire religious Zionist movement. And just to see, you could see a picture I have here of Yeshiva Merkaz Harab, who was originally founded. You could see, it's not actually, I don't know if this was when it was founded, but you could see the picture of the students. And I'll just leave you with one final story, which I guess shows you, again, that just religious personality that he had. I wrote about this story in the bulletin a number of months ago on Rav Kook's yard site. Rav Soloveitchik, who his only time ever traveling to the land of Israel was in 1935 when he applied to be the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, which he actually lost at the time. And he meets with Rav Kook in his last year of his life, and he says, he records his impressions, his memories from that meeting. And he says, it wasn't from that meeting, it was from that time in which he visited the country, and he went to a kibbutz Kinneret, one of the oldest kibbutzim. And he says that it was quite on the border of this, Marxism or Stalinism. And he says they were working in the fields, and they were working very hard. And he heard them talking about this rabbi, Rav Soloveitchik. Oh, he's an American. Not only is he an American, he's an American rabbi. And he heard like the tint of sarcasm in their voice. And he says that they were very hospitable, but he says, of course, the kitchen was totally treif, was not kosher. So they gave him grapes. Now he explained to them that this also is a problem because there's Trumas and Meisters problems, and he basically said to them, I can't eat this. They say that no, we have someone who takes off Trumas and Meistros from the Rabbanut, and our kitchen is kosher. He says, what? Your kitchen is kosher? And they say, let me tell you a story. They say that many years before, Rav Kook was traveling around the different kibbutzim, again, like trying to create sort of a dialogue and a connection between himself and the secular Zionists. And he came for Shabbos to this particular kibbutz. He came for Shabbos, and he brought his own challah and his wine. And on Friday night, he comes into the dining room, and the dining room again was completely not kosher. He sits down at the table, he says Kiddush with his own wine, makes hamotzi, and then goes to, sits down, and he doesn't eat anything else. They're moving the lights on and off. He doesn't care. They go out Saturday morning. Apparently, they had a minyan of some sorts. They didn't give him an aliyah. They go out to the fields and they're working. It's a kibbutz. That's what they did. And he doesn't really make much of an issue of it. Motzei Shabbos, they make Havdalah, and he joins in their. They have some sort of dance. He joins together with them. He dances with them. He sits down with them. Eventually, tells them some stories. Maybe they're around the campfire, I imagine, and he's telling them stories about his parents and about Europe. And he's sharing with them his sort of his inner world. And he doesn't say one word of disapproval. And as he's leaving Sunday morning from this kibbutz, the people tell Rav Soloveitchik, right, that the Rav Kook was leaving, and they say, shalom, see you later, whatever. And he says, until we meet again, until we meet again, and we'll eat a meal together. And the next day, the people decided, we're going to make the kitchen kosher. And they throw out all the dishes, and they kosher the kitchen. And Rav Soloveitchik said about Rav Kook, he was really talking to American rabbis, encouraging them to be what he called a religious personality. He said Rav Kook was not a philosopher. He was a great religious personality. And Judaism was not an idea to him. It was an experience. It was a passion. It was a love. And that was the impression that was clearly to all that encountered him. And that's why these people were so taken by him. So, he was thrust into a number of difficult positions. He had a big vision of where history was moving. He attempted to thread the needle on certain points, giving a hesped, but not mentioning Herzl, speaking at Hebrew University's inauguration, but not supporting it necessarily. But we can't forget who he was. And it's just, in some ways a tragic story, but in some ways it's an exhilarating story, because he was such a tremendous thinker, a spiritual giant. And his impact is still felt today, and we're still we haven't even yet seen all of his writings, and we're still seeing the after effects of his ideas and what his son Tzvi Yehuda created, and the whole movement. I mean, the whole Dati Lumi community, in many ways, is an outgrowth of where Rav Kook started, but it was on a much smaller and the scale. It seemed like the issues were much. The controversy was so large, but at the same time they were still working within the same basic community, and it had not yet broken from and created its own, kehila, which is a whole other story of which we don't really have time for tonight. But this has been a pleasure. It's Rav Kook. Yes, this is the final for now, but we could talk for many, many more hours. We haven't even really gotten to his writings, but I felt like have Rachmanis, and we'll hold it here.